And if you've ever been to the Columbia Archives, you know our next guest very, very well. I have in the studio with me now Barbara Kellner, and she's the director of the Columbia Archives, and she brings us some news today. Welcome to our studio, Barbara.
Thank you.
And I know you have some news, and I know some people are very, very sad with this news. Me, one of them, but I know we're going to continue to work together in the future, so I'm just going to let you break it to everybody.
I will be retiring at the end of the year after 25 years with the Columbia Association and several years before that when the Columbia Archives just was getting started.
And I had the opportunity to speak with you the other day about your background and all the work that you've done this 25 years and how it's evolved from where you started as a volunteer into the director of the Columbia Archives. So I'd like to share that story with our viewers today, but first I would like for you to tell them a little bit about yourself, where you come from, because I don't think you're from Columbia originally, is that right?
Well, some people might pick up a slight New York little accent there. So I did. I grew up in New York in the borough of Queens, and after I was married, I went to New Jersey, and it was just a couple of years later, came down to Maryland, and really that's part of my story about how this chance transfer from my husband brought me to the town of Columbia and totally changed my life.
And when you first started the Columbia Archives, you started as a volunteer, you told me the other day.
Well, I moved to Columbia and I had 2 young children, and I thought, I'm just going to be a mom. I'm not going to do anything outside of the house. And then I picked up the Columbia flyer on Thursday, and I saw a little notice about the Columbia Archives, newly formed, and they were looking for volunteers. And I didn't know much about Columbia, except that it looked good, and I went and volunteered, and they gave me things to read, and that's my story. I never stopped reading.
Why were you reading? Why was it important for your job at that point to be reading? How did it all come together as your job in the archives today?
Well, the archives really grew out of a grassroots movement of people deciding after a small exhibit, deciding that Columbia really did have a great story and it needed to be preserved for the future. And this was back in 1982 when Columbia was just about 15 years old, and it was the foresight of these people that decided to form a formal organization to capture that, and a nonprofit was formed. And so when I started as a volunteer, the reading was what got me acclimated into what they were doing at the archives and to be of some help. I had no archives training, no library training. I'm an English major. I did some writing, but really this was totally new. And then within a few years, the people who had founded the archives decided to take another path, and they left, and I was kind of the last man standing. And by then I was hooked on Columbia history.
And that was 25 years ago, correct, that you started with them?
Well, I actually started with the nonprofit organization back in 1983.
Oh, wow.
And then it was a little difficult to proceed as a nonprofit. Funding got more and more difficult, and we approached the Columbia Association, which had always supported the mission of the archives and had helped us financially. But in 1992, we became a part of the Columbia Association, and that's been very successful.
So what's the mission of the archives?
So the mission is clear. It's to collect and preserve and make available to the public the history of Columbia and of its founder, James Rouse. We take that mission very seriously to get the story of Columbia and the importance of Columbia out to the people, and also Jim Rouse's vision, because if we had more people like Jim Rouse, I think our world would be a better place.
Why is it important to then continue to have the archives?
Everything we do in the future has some basis in our history, and you can't really move forward without understanding that. And people who move to Columbia might not know the whole story. It's just a well-rounded, complete city. But how did it get that way? And how are we going to continue to keep it that way if we don't understand the importance of that mission and that vision? And generations turn over, and today's kids need to know that, and today's adults need to know that. And we can only do that by preserving the history and taking it out to the public. We have many, many, many documents. This is papers, this is correspondence and documents of reports. We have newspapers and magazine articles, of which there are thousands of articles written about Columbia. So you can get a whole story, and you can dig as much or as little as you want.
As you're retiring now, what are your plans?
My plans for retirement are to stay in Columbia and to stay involved. I can't just leave everything I love about Columbia.
Thank you for preserving the history of Columbia so we can continue to move forward.
And so please continue to visit the archives and learn about Columbia.